What is like the elevator speech that you might give for the CS Visions framework?
So I can give it a shot. I've never tried it out on an elevator, but we can see the CS Visions framework, which was developed by Rafi Santo, myself, and Dixie Ching, who could not join us on this podcast, but is a wonderful collaborator. So the CS Visions framework helps people see the values underlying rationale for CS education and those impacts that they hope it has for students, communities, in the world. Once stakeholders have a sense for those underlying values, we believe they can more coherently plan for programmatic and instructional designs and implementation. So the framework that we develop charts out what are various different underlying values and impacts that CS education can have, and how do those values potentially look like in practice? How do they drive practice? And then going back to what Rafi was saying about education as a public good, we believe sort of that by exposing people to this range of values that can drive CS education, we hope to demonstrate that pluralism in CS education is sort of a good in and of itself. Just like there's no one way to educate, there's no one way to do CS education. That's sort of it in a nutshell. We have both a paper that was developed for SIGSE, which is the Computer Science Education Conference in 2017, which sort of outlines those 7 values and impact areas that you talked about on your podcast last week. And then we also have the more practitioner-friendly resource that makes those links to practice.
And the way that I think about it always, and really the question that we started with, is CS for what? Mm-hmm. Like the CS Visions framework is a tool that helps really anybody more thoughtfully and deliberately answer the question, CS for what? And we have a very firm belief that, especially in the context of a very robust policy movement that is there, state leaders, federal leaders, even district leaders are very much pushing ahead on this. And we think that there can be a danger to rushing too quickly. We know this in general in education, that rapid reforms and rushes to change rarely work well. Even taking out questions of efficacy, a rush to implementation having impacts on efficacy and quality, we're mostly concerned in this work with impacts on actually what's being accomplished. Like if you rush to implementation and you don't think about what ultimate purpose you're wanting to have CS education in place, mm-hmm. you're probably accomplishing somebody else's goals, right? And we think of that as a problem. We want communities, educators, even tool makers, designers, curriculum designers, to really be thinking critically about like whose interests are being served by this. Are we serving the interests that we believe in, or are by not reflecting and asking ourselves the question, CS for what, are we serving some other kind of interest? And then there are a lot of other impacts on quality, which Sarah alluded to in this idea of coherence, right? If you don't have a really strong North Star, not to say that it has to be set and always stay the same, it can evolve, but if you don't have a strong North Star, how are you going to align as a district? How are you going to align your curriculum, your professional development, your course offerings, your credit requirements, your supports for students? How do you have all that aligned if you don't have a North Star around what the ultimate purposes are? If that's not in place, you'll end up with kind of a spaghetti mess, and you won't reach any outcomes well. You'll just you might have conflicting policies in place, conflicting supports in place. I think we should name some of it as we talk about this, right? A vision that's about creativity has different implications than a vision that's about economic mobility and workforce development. A vision that's about closing representation gaps has different implications than a vision that's about promoting systems thinking, as an example, which is something that can be associated with different types of CS education. And you really want to think, well, if this is for jobs, if it's for justice, if it's for innovation, each of those has implications for how you design your curriculum. They're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there might involve trade-offs, or there might also involve sequencing, right? We can say that, hey, we're oriented towards creativity in a really central way for all of our students. We want computing to be an avenue for creativity. We do have some curriculum early on that has some like puzzle-based stuff that has a predetermined answer, but that's in the sequence. of courses and learning opportunities that eventually create the possibility of maybe using much more open-ended platforms, say like Python or processing that support creativity in various ways.
And I'll also add that Rafi mentioned a couple times this sense of we, like, is our CS education showing our values? Is it reflecting the values that we care about? Well, who is this we? Is something that we've had to wrestle with as well, because if it's just the same voices that are always at the table in policy-making conversations, then your CS education might continue to serve narrow interests in conjunction with thinking about values-based planning for CS Ed. In order for it to work, you have to have a really broad sense of who the we is and engage in what could be like fairly messy deliberative processes with lots of voices, especially those that aren't often at the table, like families. You know, if you have immigrant families in your communities, making sure that your outreach is available in different languages, thinking about students with disabilities, thinking about teachers at various levels. These are all the voices that have to be at the table so that you can really capture what your community believes CS education is for.
Yeah, and really the underlying value that we have behind this work, and it might sound, kind of highfalutin, but it really is democracy, right? We, I think, believe deeply in the idea of education as a public good, and B, a democratically oriented public good, right? That it must be something where it is collectively determined what shape this public good takes, because it is about all of us. And the idea of having deliberative tools and processes, whether it's about CS education or not, to us is very powerful. It's about really realizing these democratic ideals of education.
This excerpt was from podcast number 21 of the CSK8 podcast, which was titled The CS Visions Framework, an Equity-Centered Computing Education with Rafi Santo and Sara Vogel. You can listen to the full episode as well as hundreds more by searching for the CSK8 podcast on your favorite podcast app.